Welcome to Zen and the Art of Self-Publishing. It's the podcast where we slow down, get honest, and put the human back at the center of author life. I'm your host, Janet Margot, so come on in and let's talk.
Awesome.
All right, I have today with me Jennifer Hilt. She is a USA Today bestselling author of the Trope Thesaurus, the Horror Trope Thesaurus, the Romance Thesaurus, the Trope Thesaurus Fantasy and Science Fiction, and most recently, the Trope Thesaurus Mystery and Thriller, co-authored with Sarah Rosette, who also has a fantastic podcast. Jennifer has written 24 books under 4 pen names, plus the urban fantasy series, The Undead Detective. Welcome, welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Janet. It's always fun to visit with you, so
I know. I love our chats. Last time we were talking, I was like, wait. I want to talk about this when I interview for you for the podcast. So, cool. You've done a lot. You've written 24 books across 4 pen names. And now you've basically become a go-to resource on tropes. So was there a specific moment when you realized you needed to do a thesaurus on this? Tell me about that.
Basically, I just wanted to answer the question of what was a trope, because I wasn't clear on what that was, but I felt like I was using it when I was teaching. And at the time that I was doing that, probably like 5 years ago, the reaction to my students was really negative if I used the word trope.
Because it was too commercial?
This would be literally what multiple times they said. When they would explain a concept to me, I'd say, oh, okay, you're talking about these, like, say these 3 tropes, like, best friend, found family, and I don't know, ticking time bomb to say. And they would go, I wanted to write a good story. That was like so fascinating to me, that reaction, their emotional reaction, because it was like, when you talk to somebody if they're brainstorming a story, doing the building thing, you're like trying to struggle like with what are the ideas, what are the blocks, right, to put that story together. And so I was like, oh, we're using tropes as our blocks as we're doing this. And that the like emotional negativity that the students would feel if I labeled that such was really the most interesting thing to me, because first of all, you don't want, creating a story is hard. You want your students to do their best work, feel their best, create, and so to like see them kind of like deflate in that way was like what drove me to think, well, what is a trope? Why do we need it? And why is there this like real shame about it? But that was like the kernel of, I never set out to like write a trope book. I just was like, I'm going to like explore and study and figure out like what everything I know. And then as that grew, I'm like, okay, well, maybe this is a book, and I can put it in one place. And then that's kind of how everything grew. I didn't really have I wished I could say, oh, I had this like plan and I thought it out and all this. It was mostly like to answer this question that was really bugging me. And something that I was really curious about, and like for myself, like, well, what is a trope? Like, why do we need common storytelling building blocks, and yet why is there kind of these feelings about it? I think the interesting thing is like, if we fast forward to now, there's been such a huge shift in our, cultural landscape that's not the same. Many people don't have the same reaction to using tropes that they did at the time that I put the book out. And at the time that I put the book out, and I've mentioned this before, I was so new. I mean, I'd published fiction, but I was obviously new in nonfiction. And so I, queried like a lot of podcasts at the time with my book idea, and basically got radio silence except for Joanna Penn.
What year was this?
I'm trying to remember when I was just thinking the other day when the book came out. I think because I was working on it during the pandemic, and then
wasn't it 2021?
Yes, 2021.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Because I think I started working on it in 2019, and then it came out like January 1st, 2021. But just trying to get the years straight. But it was just really interesting to me.
Ahead of the game, so.
I'm sorry?
Joanna Penn's always ahead of the game,
yeah.
so.
Yeah, I mean, I was like shocked, and that was just like a huge experience because I had like 0 podcasting experience, so that's another story. But it was just kind of like really interesting that there was like, now there's tons of people talking about tropes everywhere. Like, it's not in, And I was seeing that happening in media, like lots of movie talk about tropes,
Yeah.
because I'm like a total, and I love BuzzFeed. My kids always laugh at me about that. But, it'll be like what are your top 10, enemies to lovers movie,
Yeah.
and those kind of things. And I would be thinking, that's interesting. Like, they don't seem to have a problem calling that out.
Well, even when like I don't know if they still do this, but when I worked in film, like in the 90s, when you would do a pitch for film, it always was like very tropey, or it was always
Yeah,
really sort of reductive in the comparison that you would be making.
correct.
It's a buddy movie. It's,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. Yeah, so I didn't like, it wasn't like this, like, smooth trajectory. And I really, for the first book, put everything that I knew at the time into it, because I thought, I'm never doing this again. No, I really didn't think anybody would really be interested, or at least enough to like want to talk to me about it.
right.
So then it was just really, so after that it grew. It was interesting of just of like people were wanting to know more. And then we asked questions that made me want to know like more too. But yeah, it wasn't like, I don't know. I think the biggest thing was just having a question and like following it through to an answer.
So before we go in even
Yeah.
further, define a trope for
Sure.
me.
Yeah. So that was like the biggest kind of part of the whole research project, was me figuring that out. And for me to figure out how I wanted to differentiate tropes versus cliches, because the biggest
Yeah.
thing was they seemed at the time to be very much in the same pod, was that a trope is, a trope is something that's easily defined, recognizable. If you're like, I say, like if you're over, a fourth grade reading level, you were going to know what, an orphan is, or a warrior, or friends to lovers, or something. Like you understand what the concept is by the words. It doesn't need like any fancy definitions. And it's really a building block to story. So that's like the first thing is it's recognizable and immediately understood. The second is like a building block to story. And like third thing that I come to really appreciate about it is a trope doesn't really have any connotation to it. So if you want to write an enemies to lovers story, you can have those characters can be the antagonists or the protagonists, or you can have side characters who have that. There's not like a value judgment about the characters. They're not good or bad people. And I felt like the kind of problem that I kept seeing with tropes is they were always labeled maybe bad, when it wasn't the idea that was bad, it was maybe the execution. So I separated out kind of tropes as this like the raw materials, and cliches, which would be like improperly developed tropes idea.
Oh,
So that was kind of,
interesting.
I'm sorry?
Interesting. I mean, that's an important nuance.
Yeah, so because, and to me, that really makes sense. Because the other thing I think, the difference that I think of with cliches is that, well, cliches have this very value image, like the ones I tend to think of are like gold digger, or stupid, or a dumb jock, or dumb blonde, And you can write a story about somebody who has, learning challenges, or you can write a story about a woman who's having financial challenges or whatever, but you don't have to label it like in that very reductive way. You can have all these other elements about those characters. And that's
Right.
what we do see, right? But cliches just tend to be very flat. Like those are like those two-dimensional characters that we generally try to avoid to create, really enriching characters. So that was kind of like the biggest thing for me, was to separate that out. And the way I did that was just kind of going and looking at all kinds of books and movies, things from like Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass, which was like this great fantasy series, and like realizing, oh my gosh, he has tropes. And looking at like David, I don't talk about it a lot, but he's still one of my favorites, of David Sedaris, realizing he uses tropes. And he's like a terrific, current storyteller, but like, oh, he uses all these like building blocks for his story. And
So
so
even
like,
in essays and
yeah,
memoir, it's not
yeah,
just in fiction, it's all across
yeah.
the board.
Yeah, because the other thing that, like, kind of like the fourth thing, that's really the thing that took me the realization of all this, was that why tropes are important and why they deserve being talked about, and why you really can't avoid them if you want to, even if you want to call it a different name, is that they're about relationships, a human understanding. And that's what our stories are about. So, like, even something of like a loner or a warrior, those are like two really common tropes, right? There's lots of stories about orphans of any kind, or warriors.
Right.
Those characters are going to go on some kind of journey, and they're going to meet some other kind of people, And they're gonna go from being this singleton into having these relationships, and that's really what that story is. But those are like the kernels for it. So to me, that was kind of like the meat of the work, was kind of figuring out. I figure, and it's because it's a subjective thing, I figure there's about maybe 40 to 50 tropes that can be used commonly in any genre. Then it's kind of like how you use them. But we obviously see those few that I've mentioned in any kind of story. It doesn't have to be, it's not a specific, I don't feel like if you write romance, you need to know these specific tropes. If you write mystery, you need to know these specific tropes. It's like kind of one big pot of tropes. And then what you're learning is, how do I combine them? What do my readers want in terms of expectations for that genre? And like, how do I dig into character?
Let's talk about then using the tropes, like the execution. How do you use your tropes or your tropes thesaurus in particular to craft story?
I think the other like big thing that I think is important about tropes is, I don't think tropes like exist alone in isolation. So like for me, when I was doing all this research, I was realizing tropes work when you are able to identify like, what are your characters' like goal, motivation, and conflict, and know what kind of, have an idea of what kind of story you're writing and what do your readers expect. So like, I talk a lot about tropes in relation to GMC, goal, motivation, conflict, and then genre expectations, and how to use them. I don't want it to be very prescriptive of like, you need to write your story this way. What I want is for people to realize there's tropes out here. Here are some ways to think about them. Here are some possible ways to use them if you're stuck in your story, or you want to go deeper, or you want to revise, or like think about maybe, is there a way I can work on characters from this angle, or plot from that angle?
But
So
I have a couple of your trope thesauruses. So would you say that it's a good planning tool, like in outlining or brainstorming, or do you think it's like a rescue tool when you're trying to fix parts of it? Like, how do you see that?
I really wanted it to be used whatever you need. Like, I don't want it to be like, you have to use it for outlining, I want it to be like something you can dip into if you're stuck. So yes, I mean, if it's helpful to think about them and you can do it all the way from your outlining, that's great. But I don't want it to be like, I have this system and you need to like buy my system.
So
You know what I mean?
yeah, it's not super prescriptive. Oh, I totally get that. I totally get that even with ads.
Yeah,
I'm
right,
like,
yeah,
there's
right. Because
here's all the
there's a
information,
certain,
but it's different.
yeah, there's a certain art to it, and
Yeah.
like I just want to like put the blocks or like the knowledge out there, and the encouragement for people to like experiment and think, and really to look and see how stories put together, and then use it that way, as opposed to saying like, okay, before you sit down you need to do these things. There's certainly like things I've noticed from doing this for several years now, a lot, that keep recurring again and again, in terms of like tropes and like ways to set up a story, that I think is pretty helpful. And a lot of times if I'm watching a movie or reading a book or something and I notice I'm like losing interest, I'll be like, a lot of times I notice like there's not a ticking time bomb that's like enough in the story to have the stakes. And I don't think that's like a kind of thing I thought about in this way before I started these books.
Well, I'm using it right now as I write my first mystery thriller or thriller. I don't know. I'm trying to understand I'm trying to understand where on the spectrum it is. And I know I sort of asked you about this before offline in another conversation, which is why I wanted to have you on here. I've been since I'm a new writer in the genre, I have like skimmed through the book and now I'm going back to it. And so it's been really helpful in me because I'm trying to really set my genre expectations very clearly from the beginning as best as I can. Because, I work with authors usually when they're on the other side of things, when the book's already out and then there's some of these problems, like they don't know what genre it is. Right. And I have to say they're the most difficult authors to work with, not personally, but in terms of helping them with their ads, like if they don't know what their genre is. So I've been trying to use it as like a preliminary tool in planning the book. And now as I'm outlining, and if I get stuck in something, then I'm kind of going back through the book.
First of all, I want to say there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of mixing of mystery and thriller at this time. And I feel like there used to be historically much more of a differentiation because of
Yeah.
like, you were going to the bookstore.
Yeah.
I, so I really loved, for an example, Sarah Paretsky. Her book now is out, The Skate Carpetta.
Mm-hmm.
So that book came out super long ago, like 30 years ago. And that was a female protagonist, and she did these mystery. It was, I would have said, that was very much in the mystery genre at that time, because every book had a problem that was being solved, and she was really the detective, even though she's a medical examiner. But now that series to me looks like it's totally being sold as a thriller with Nicole Kidman. It
Oh,
seems
interesting.
much more less, like much more kind of high stakesy,
Yeah.
you know, kind of tension than the kind of grind of going through the
Mm-hmm.
isolation of solving an investigation. So I think it's interesting. I think it's partly a marketing issue, but Sarah,
Right.
the thing that Sarah and I kind of help or talk about to like keep our own brains straight with it, and just from experience, was like, a mystery is like, is justice being served? So you're trying to find out who is the killer, or who took the kid, or whatever. Like, you're trying to figure out who that person is and how that question. And then thriller is really very high stakes in terms of like, is the person going to survive? And a lot of times, so those are like two kind of big, those are
Yeah.
like two ways. But like I said, I see those combined a lot now because I am a huge fan of the dark, brooding Scandinavian detective
Oh,
series.
yeah.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this before. I just love those guys. Men and women, they're all depressed, it's dark, they're alcoholic, it's whatever. Those are like my jam of like, ooh, just gonna slip in this world and like help them solve
Yeah,
these.
me too.
Yeah, yeah. But if you note, it's really interesting because a lot of them, so they would be, I think, really, and a lot of them come from really successful books that were very, very written as mystery.
Right.
But a lot of them are also now filmed as with this thriller aspect of like, if I see any of those people have a dependent of any kind, I'm like, guess who's going to get snatched in the 11th hour by the serial killer?
Oh, and that's so true.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so like now it's like hard because it's like, I'm always kind of like, oh man, why do they have to be divorced and have a kid? Couldn't they just be divorced and like not have a kid? Because now
Right.
I know this kid's gonna go missing. And they do, and that why that happens is another very interesting conversation, which I don't know if we have time for or you want to, but whatever. But anyway, the point is like there's more mixing, kind of the two things. So
Yeah.
I think as long as you are providing answers to the questions that you pose. So, like, if you're trying to figure out who did the crime and make sure that person is either, in the end identified, first of all, and then
Right.
whether they're punished or not is like your decision, but like we need to know who did it versus, have they, stopped the bomb or, the bank heist or those kind of things that are kind of traditionally thriller. If you look at the Department Q, I don't know if you
Yeah.
watched on Netflix. That I think is just a fantastic was originally a Danish book series that I just loved so much, and they
I
have
have to
changed
write
it.
this down. I have not, it's been on my list and I actually have not watched it yet.
It's really fun to watch. It's just the visual. The Department Q is very different than the books it was based on.
But isn't that also like have to do with like visual attention spans and whatnot with just
I
TV,
think
social media, all visual entertainment needs to be operating at a faster pace these days? Do you think books are following that?
Well, I think in the case of these Scandinavian books, for 100%, these books that I love so much are set in Denmark, Copenhagen,
Yeah.
very regional, very culturally Danish. The series was moved to the UK and is much more, I feel, accessible to American audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Where there's not so much about like what Danish culture is, right, at
Yeah.
all, because it's set
Yeah.
in the UK. So it's much more familiar and easy for, I think, Americans to understand. So I think that there's a lot of, I would say, broadening of visual media storytelling so that you can get like the biggest audience for a variety of reasons. But
Yeah.
but I still love, like, if you're going to read, I would go read the series, and then just the TV series. I in my mind really almost think of it as a different thing because it's so different in character and stuff like that. But it's an interesting way to look at of like how one is like maybe more mystery and one is like mystery thriller.
Wait, though, so this is super interesting to me as we're talking about the books and then we're talking about a movie adaptation. The tropes are the same, but then they're executed differently.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the plots for both of those, the plots for those books, for that first book that was turned into this current series, Department Q, same plot, but the characters are very different in my view. I mean, they're, have the similar names and things like that, but there's this kind of, I would say, a more hopeful or upbeat, if it's possible to have upbeat and that level of derangement in the in the Netflix series versus the books, which are pretty bleak. I mean, it's so but they're the same tropes. It's just how they're, which is cool, right? Because that's what we're talking about, is how they can be delivered in different ways
and not feel stale.
Right.
Because that goes back to the cliche thing. But you mentioned something. I had a question for you about if you feel like there's any trope that's generally overused to the point of being sort of broken. Would the child that goes missing, would that fit into an overuse, or are you just like watching a specific genre or reading a specific genre so much that you're like, okay, here we go again?
I think it's probably more of a me problem.
Okay.
It kind of depends. I think what's interesting is, why does the child need to go missing, right? So that's what I started thinking about. Because, like, what if they took, like, it was just, usually it'll, like, this, say, for example, it's not Department Q because I won't remember it in that much detail right this second, but a detective in this fictional story is tracking a serial killer, and 3 kids have gone missing. And it's, everything's been getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and they've been found in horrible, blah, blah, blah. So the 4th kid that goes missing, if it's like it needs to be somebody close to the detective, right? It needs to be personal. It needs to have that motivation, as opposed to it's just a job.
It's higher stakes.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think that's why we see the kid or whoever it is go missing, or, sometimes it'll be like a girlfriend or something like that. But it's just kind of neat to think, to realize, it's necessary for character motivation. Once I figure that out, it's like, okay, I get it, because how else are you going to motivate this character in such a way to go to the extreme that they've been avoiding all along, or to reveal this part of themselves. So the thing about tropes that I have discovered after a long time was really, and I talked a little bit about how important goal, motivation, and conflict is. It's taken me a really long time to appreciate goal, motivation, and conflict. It's really, motivation is huge. Like, the goal is like, find the kid, or, find the treasure, or, solve whatever. Right. But how you motivate that character, or what that character's motivation is really the kind of secret sauce that keeps us coming back to characters again and again, digging down into like what those layers are. And so that to me was like something, when I started this project out, I would never have understood that. Like, that's something that's, I've learned along the way. And I think it's really interesting now. And I noticed that, if something isn't working, it's usually like, what's your motivation? What's the character? What's the character's motivation? Not your motivation, but like, you can have a motivation as a storyteller for it to do something, but that character needs to have that motivation. And there was, when my kids were little, we were seeing like a therapist for something, because that's how life goes. And this woman, who is like so smart, said to me, I could retire if I had 2 pills, one for motivation and one for sibling rivalry. And I was like, this lady's a genius. Like, it was like she was talking about, my own kids, but it was like, she'd been doing this job for a long time. And so she was onto something about like, you can't, it's, human motivation is that complex. It's that primal. And it's like that, for lack of a better word, motivating, of driving us and driving our stories. So I think like when people like if you want to disregard tropes, sure, but figure out another way that you're going to show us what those compelling, ways to create compelling characters. Because that's, if you can do it another way, then fine. But that's what's really the important part of all this, is like getting to that.
So, do you think that there's a difference in the value or the need for tropes in a standalone book versus a series? Like for series, does it become more difficult? Does it become more critical for series read through? Is there an overarching trope? Like,
Right.
can you speak to that?
Those are a lot of kind of little different questions. First of all, this was not readily apparent to me, so if this is helpful to other people, then it maybe will save you some time. When you do a series, usually one of the through lines, the questions that run through that your character's picking away at, that keeps people coming back, is a question about that character's identity in some way. And the best example of that is an older series, but really good. I reread it and I was like, damn, she's that. Kinsey Milhone, Sue Grafton's A is for Alibi.
Oh yeah, okay.
And I, when I first read that series, and that's like 35 years ago, and she was like, her and Sarah Pretsky, we were like awash in male detectives, like awash, right? Except for like the Agatha Christie, Miss Marple, there was, though they were primarily what was out there, except for like Agatha Christie stuff, I felt like, in traditional publishing, when I was
Right.
looking for something to read. But what was interesting was those books came out and I was like loving them, but I was like, I don't care if she's an orphan and whatever, like I didn't care about that. But as the series continued, I was like noticing that I was like, oh, but she's found this other little piece of this puzzle, this other little piece of this puzzle. Oh, she might have a cousin. Oh, she has a cousin. Well, and like that trickled through. And so I was going to read the books anyway because I really liked them. But there are a lot of people who will read a series through because of those secondary kind of questions that are being answered. Like Sarah has a great example of her, I don't remember which series, but she has a series with a couple in it. And like everybody wants that couple to get together, and they're like, and like that's what she gets mail about. Like people are buying the
Oh
series.
wow.
They want to know when, Mary and Joe or whatever, when are they going to get together? And Sarah's just like laughing.
What genre is that though?
It's one of her cozy mystery series.
Okay, so it's cozy mystery. So
Yeah.
because like I would expect that if you had said that's in romance.
Yeah, but cozy mysteries, I
Right.
think, really have, I really feel like cozy mysteries often have a very strong B. Their B storyline has some romance slash family element to it. Like there's some relationship-y stuff in there.
What about buddies?
Yeah, I mean, it could
Okay.
be buddies. It's just like there needs to be some like kind of trajectory, like it could be, maybe they start out, not as great as friends or colleagues and they become closer, or something like
Yeah.
that. There needs to be, so I feel like that's super important for series, are having tropes that are explored, that keep the reader coming back to wanting to know more. And a lot of times we see, like in romance, that's why you have like the book of a series with 5 brothers.
Yeah.
Because, everybody, oh, I want to read the one with this, what's going to happen to that one and that one and that one. And that's the reason why it's so popular is because it works, because we're human and because we want to know, oh, so how's it going to turn out for him? So I think that's just really important to realize, that tropes do help you through series. I personally love a standalone because I feel like they've 100%, the authors 100% threw it all in on this one story, right? Like
Yeah.
all going to be like, I'm going to get like kind of all the good stuff, you don't have to
Yeah.
wait for other things. So, but that's in reality. And I still read plenty of series, so it's not like that I don't,
Yeah.
but I think that in reality, the work of series is really seeding those other relationships and those other tropes to be followed through. So anyway, so the first question of that would be, I would have one of your main characters have some kind of identity issue of your choosing, but that's being worked through with a series. And then you asked me if it was tropes versus in a series versus a standalone, and I guess I just kind of answered
Yeah.
that. Sorry, inarticulately, but what was the
And you
third?
said there was an arc. Just
Yeah.
so my question was,
Mhm.
one of my questions
Sure.
was about, do you think it helps propel read through it all? And the answer is yeah, because
Yeah,
they're trying to
absolutely.
follow The overarching.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
if you notice one problem, and I think it's kind of like a storytelling structural problem that I don't know that we have an answer for, but if I've noticed a lot of times I love like the secondary characters, right? And that's also when I'm writing something, almost always they're my favorite characters. It's kind of like, yeah, the main character's doing all the work and all this kind of stuff. But you get these like cool, quirky, and a lot of times in books I'll be like, oh yeah, and so I want to know more about that character. And a lot of times in romance it'll be like, oh, the sassy best friend that gets her own book down the line or something
Yeah.
like that. But what I think is interesting is when the sassy best friend becomes the main character, it's harder, right? I feel like it's harder to kind of maintain that aura of maybe it's somewhat mystery, maybe it's kind of like having too much ice cream or too much cake. I'm not saying all the time, but I think it's just kind of like I think those secondary characters can provide such spice and just a differentness of flavor that they really can help structure your whole series.
Well, it's interesting because it's just like when you think of in theater and film, like there's great ensemble casts, but not usually when it's everybody can't be a leading lady.
Right,
That
right.
it's the blend, it's the collaboration together that really works.
Yeah,
Not everybody can just take center stage and carry the show,
right.
so to speak.
But like, did you happen to see The Expanse?
No.
No. Well, I'm just going to briefly use an example in case somebody else
Okay.
watches it, because it has a good example of that. It's basically, if I was to pitch it, I'd say it's the good, bad, and the ugly in space. It's a really great space opera, and it's like I had no idea. Like we've watched the whole series multiple times throughout the seasons. It's just really good. There's a character in there, very secondary character, Amos, who's he's a pretty minor character, and he's kind of like somebody said he's like a jarhead, like he's just
Oh
like a
yeah.
military kind of character.
Yeah.
But I have not yet met one person who talking about that series says, "Oh my God, don't you love Amos?" And they don't talk. Nobody talks about the guy who's the big head of it, James Holden. He's the totally the hero, and he's the reluctant hero, and he's blah blah blah. But Amos has like the best lines. He has like the best kind of facial expressions. They use him very sparingly, but you're always like when he's on the screen, you're like, zoom. What's Amos doing?
That's like the true definition of a supporting character. I mean, that they are literally supporting, they're really important for that support,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
But again, they're not going to take center
Yeah.
stage or they're,
And
yeah.
well, find myself wondering, like, what would happen if, because I think my husband had said time to time, oh, I wish we knew Amos's story because they cleverly trickle out his backstory in these very, very tantalizing, very, bite-sized nuggets. We don't know. And it usually comes out through dialogue, which is just another thing of like, you're just like, oh, I'm in the hands of good storytelling when people can do that. So, for example, on this one other example, he is explaining up in space, so it all takes place in space, and he's explaining to a woman how you walk in gravity boots on a ship. And he says, and she's always been earthbound, so she has no idea. And he says, you just kind of lean back into him like you do with heels. And this is a very feminine woman, and she says, what do you know about wearing high heels? And he says, it didn't always work in space. And you're just like, oh my God, like, who is this character? Yeah. I mean, like, it tells you so much, but it's like such a great example of his character because it's just like, it leaves you hungry. Like, it gives you a little bit of a taste, it leaves you hungry. So I do wonder, like, if I had a whole Amos novel or if I had a whole Amos series, would he then need supporting characters around him?
He would, yeah.
Yeah. So if somebody could solve that little problem of just creating all the great side characters, that would be great.
So if we switch now to marketing, coming towards my neck of the woods, how do you recommend authors think about tropes as a discoverability strategy, if at all?
I do think it's really important to know in this day and age what your tropes are. If you don't want to use them for story creation, because I think a lot of times authors use them instinctively, intuitively, without needing to label them, which is totally fine. But I think when it comes to marketing them, you should know what they are.
Yes.
And I like often say, give your book to another writer, ask them like, okay, what are the tropes you see in this? They're going to find a bunch of them. What you want to do is figure out what are the ones that are the hot tickets, kind of the hot.
Reach The biggest audience basically for
Correct.
that. Yeah.
Yes, and have the greatest conflict, and have like, you know, if you have like like you have a subplot of like a best friend's little sister or boy next girl or boy next door kind of thing, that's not going to be the trope that you want to talk about in your blurb or in your, you know, your TikTok video or any of your kind of thing. If that's just kind of like a B storyline, because you're probably not going to, it's not going to have as much juice as something of like, oh, there are all these other tropes of like, you know, secrets and scars and things like that. So I think it's really important to know what your tropes are, because audiences now really are savvy to them in a way that they weren't, you know, 5 years ago.
What about
So
on the cover?
yeah, because well, like look at all the ways now that they're literally pointed out on the cover.
Yeah.
And we've both been in this business a long time, and you used to work at Amazon, right? So you probably remembered how they used to be, it used to be considered like shame. I would say shameful if your book had like 6 tropes in the, you know, it'd be like maybe, I don't know, Mary's Day Out or something, right? Like that's the stupid title, but and then you could have like enemies to lovers and this and a that and a this and a
Yeah.
that and this story. Like you would be like, oh, like no, we would never do that. Trad wouldn't do that. That just looks tacky. Now readers are looking for stories that have their favorite tropes in them. You know what I mean? So it's like
And
it's
Trad's
totally
doing a lot more of that in
yeah,
subtitles.
I
Yeah.
know. That's what
Yeah.
I thought was fascinating. And I've seen that with trad books too.
So I think
And
that's
those like,
one thing I
yeah.
would suggest, even if I can pipe in here from a marketing perspective too, is that, you know, when you can add that, I'll say the primary trope in a subtitle, it's super helpful for the algorithms and for discoverability. But when people, and also in your Kindle keywords, but I don't see as much search volume on those long tail. They're very niche keywords. That's
Oh,
just not how things are working right now in volume. You can
huh.
still advertise against those keywords, but it's not going to pull in the same volume that some more general terms might pull in.
I think some ones I see again and again, which makes me like, obviously enemies to lovers, that's always on the top of it.
Yeah.
Also like various kind of across the tracks, which would be, could in romance would be something of like, you know, rich guy, poor girl, you know,
Yeah.
kind of thing like that.
Yeah.
Those are off, like those kind of things. I think when you are you want, like I said, you want to be alluding to like the biggest conflict in your book. If your book is a mystery and there has, you know, a whole bunch of like secret identity, hidden identity stuff, you're going to want to allude to that. You don't have to say like what that is if that's a
Right.
core part of your plot, but but those are the books that you read. Well, like the housemaid stuff. All her blurbs are very tropey, right? We're like, oh, the secret and her scar and her secret and her, like they have a certain cadence to them.
Yeah.
And readers really respond to that of like, oh, it's going to be this kind of, you know, soapy, juicy mystery, but it's going to be, you know, in a cool setting with cool clothes and stuff like that. So
How do you feel about this? May be a loaded question, but how do you feel about now how authors are using AI tools more and more, whether it's in creation or whether it's in marketing, including back-end metadata, all of it. And I'm not here to judge any of that right now, but with AI as a tool to identify this stuff, what is your gut reaction to that? Do you still think people themselves, humans, still need to understand tropes? Or is it just as much as like asking ChatGPT, which I hate, questions?
right. I personally think that yes, human authors need to understand, like, because people are like, oh, I asked AI for whatever, and it told me to use these tropes for my story.
Yeah.
Okay, you take that information, but then you need to know what's the goal, motivation, and you know, like if you don't dig deeper, if you don't kind of like do your own creative work, then you're going to get a very bland, vanilla-y story, for lack of a better term. It kind of
Yeah.
sounds a lot.
Generic.
Yeah, generic, right.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot like a lot of other stories. And the problem with that is there are a lot of other stories out there right now, especially when it's super easy to create them using this. So I think you need to make sure that your voice is not suppressed and your thinking is not suppressed if you're going to use those tools. So that's kind of like the biggest thing that I see, is that, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I didn't like math in school, right? So if somebody gave me the answer, I was like, good, this one's done, I can move on, right? If you have that same way with writing. We're like, okay, I was told to use these tropes, and now I'm just gonna like move on without like really thinking, how am I incorporating this? How do they play together? What is the like? I'm building, because we're building emotional connections, right? What we're trying to do is simulate the emotions that people have in real life without actually being real life. So we're going to skip all the boring crap we have to go through and get to all the good parts. So in order to do that, I feel like you need to be a human who's experiencing those emotions.
I think also, though, you know, like you've given writers a vocabulary for all this that maybe didn't exist or didn't exist widely before you started doing the trope thesauruses. I can't, that's a mouthful for me to say. But over time, like you said, some writers are already doing this intuitively. Over time, this all should become much more intuitive, and we shouldn't necessarily need to lean on external tools as much as we get deeper into writing in genres. So would you say that AI kind of short circuits the process of it becoming intuitive in your writing? Like if you're going to rely on that too much and like without trying to understand it, you're just like checking off boxes on a menu?
You know, I don't know. I mean, yes, to me, that would seem like the answer is yes. But I haven't, it's not been around long enough so I can say. Like, so I mean, I just think of like this process of me, it's taken me a long time to be a to like grow into being a storyteller, even though
Yeah.
when I was a little kid, I was always interested in telling stories.
Yeah.
When I look at like my 10-year-old nephews who are intensely interested in storytelling, I wonder what their experience will be like because they have all these different tools and everything is really different. It's not even like a little bit different. It's like really different, you know? I don't know. I think the biggest thing I want to advocate for is critical thinking, and
Yeah.
not to give over your power as a person or creator to somebody else to give you an answer, even though time, energy levels, blah, 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 all those things can make it, I think, seductive, you know, to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like what you have to offer is, I think, your also superpower, you know,
Yeah.
and that gets lost in something that's sourcing all this other information and giving you kind of the most likely variables, I guess. I'm not even, I mean, it's also, there's a lot I don't understand about how it all works. But I think the biggest thing is it just makes me anxious, the thought of like handing over your power
Yeah.
and being like,
That's
well, I
fair.
was going to do it this way. I wanted to write a story about this, but ChatGPT or whatever told me to, no, I should write a story about that. And it was like, well, why? You know, like I don't know
Well, I
what that.
think that's the thing that's missing to a lot of it is the why.
Yeah, like what,
Yeah.
and if it's your impetus to do I think gut feeling and following your impetus is very important. I mean, I never sent a survey or asked anybody, like, I want to explore tropes. What do you think about that? I literally never did that. And maybe I would have done that in this at first. Well, at first I didn't do it because given at the time it was so like, oh my God, what a hack. Why would you do that? But now it's so easy, I would imagine, to do that. Like I should type it in and see what it would say if I asked, like, what if I write a book about tropes? Like, what do you think about
I
that?
bet it would recommend your books.
I don't know. That would be funny, but probably it would. Just because it, has every, read everything basically at this point. But I think that's the biggest thing is that it's really hard to understand. It's so hard to learn critical thinking and to think for yourself and to work through and struggle through the whys and the motivations and stuff. And like, so to kind of give that over is a slippery, dangerous slope, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we need to start wrapping up. I have a question for any newer authors that are out there, or a question that could hopefully help any newer authors that are out there. What are one or two trope related decisions that they should matter most to what they're doing?
That's a great question. I think I haven't really talked about it, but tropes really play together well, right? So you're not going to write a book about even like something like Fourth Wing, which is a huge enemies to lovers trope thing. I mean, it's everywhere. You don't even have to read the book to know that. There's a whole bunch of other tropes in there. It is not the only trope in there. And so you need your job with when you are figuring that is what other tropes pair with it well, with the ones I've chosen.
Aha.
What helps support the conflict, what helps support the what helps build your story
Yeah.
by those other things. So I think that is really important.
That's
And
great advice.
yeah, so just realizing that, yeah, it's not, tropes never exist in isolation, and that really to think of them as relationship builders. And your job is to like take, I like think of them as like a cement block or something like that. And your job is you're going to build a house, but you need something for the framework. And that's
Yeah.
how I think about them. But from that, you can build whatever kind of dwelling you want, right?
Yeah.
So just kind of, but you're using those key elements so that you have some idea of what you're doing. So I think as newer storytellers, I think it's mostly if you're a new storyteller, it's really important that you keep going to the end and persist through being confused, being, discouraged, and just,
Yeah.
I always, because this happens to all storytellers, but you maybe think, oh, if somebody's written a book or something and they don't have, oh, it happens to all of us like all the time. I always go back to where in the story did I last feel excited. If I've run out of juice in a story, it's because I've lost the conflict thread somewhere or something. So then I need to go back to like, where was I last, like what's going to happen next? There's like stuff unanswered here that I need to follow through. Like I feel like keep returning to that will keep you eventually going forward. And if you think about it, it's the same thing as for readers, right? Where we're just like, what's going to happen next?
Yeah. Yeah.
Pages, and it's similar like that with obviously as the writer. So those are the things of just to keep going and pushing through, and then like getting help when you need it, of like, oh, I need to like talk to a buddy about it, or find a writing partner, or take a class or whatever. But it's not I guess I have more final things to say than I thought. Kate Atkinson is a
Bring
British
it on.
Kate Atkinson is a fantastic British mystery writer, but now she writes a bunch of Jackson. I'm trying to remember his name. Anyway, some of her stuff has also been made into movies and things like that. Hear her speak once, and she's as delightful in person as she is as a writer. Which, if you've actually met some of your favorite writers, sometimes that's not the case.
Right, right.
But she said something and it made me feel so much better. And she said she writes in like larger circles, kind of like a spiral, almost like a seashell. And I was like, oh, because I am unfortunately not the type of writer who can sit down at page 1 and I finish it like page 235 and I'm done. I write like some of this, and then I figure out some of the middle, and then I'll go to the end, and then I go back. And it's not a pretty, it's not a thing I sit down to feel good about myself. No. But you just kind of like keep pushing through. And when she said that, oh, she writes like a 20,000 word draft, then she'll write a 40,000 word draft. I was like, oh, yeah, that's what I can do that. Like, I'm still a writer if I do that. And so I was always so like grateful, because I didn't get that before.
Right.
So I think it's kind of whatever way you push through to get the words down that's what's important.
Right. That's great. That's great advice.
Oh, yeah.
Great insight.
It's awesome.
Where can people check your stuff out? Where can they?
Everything is through my website at www.jenniferhilt.com. The books are there. You can also, I have a free Substack where I like talk about movies and books
fun.
on a frequent basis. Yeah, and that you can read for, I don't have a charge for that. So, yeah. Just
Awesome.
yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I will talk to you soon.
Okay.
Well, that's our show. Find resources and more at zenandtheartofselfpublishing.com. I'm Janet, and I'll see you next time. Until then, take a deep breath, trust your work, and keep writing.